We begin reading today the Book of Esther, the Book of Esther, chapter 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, this is the Ahasuerus who reigned from India even to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat upon the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants. The power of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces were before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty, many days, 180 days. And when these days had expired, the king made a feast to all the people who were present, in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white, green, and blue hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rings, and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver upon a pavement of red and blue, and white and black marble. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being different from one another, and royal wine in abundance according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, no one compelling, for so the king had commanded all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Also Vashti, the queen, made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to the king Ahasuerus. Now on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 officers who served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with a royal crown, in order to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was beautiful to look upon. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command by his officers. Therefore the king was very angry, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all who knew law and judgment, and the next to him was Karshina, Shetar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face, and who sat the first in the kingdom. What shall we do to the queen Vashti according to law, because she has not done the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the officers? And Memucan answered before the king and princes, Vashti the queen has not only done wrong to the king, but also to all the princes and to all the people who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall she become known to all women, so that her husbands shall despise in their eyes, and it shall be reported that King Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she did not come. The ladies of Persia and Media shall say the same unto all the king's princes who have heard of the deed of the queen. So there shall be too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let there be a royal command from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be changed, that Vashti came no more before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal state unto another, who is better than she is. And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all his empire, for it was great, all the wives shall give their husband honor, both the great and the small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters into all the provinces of the king, into every province according to the writing of it, and to every people in their language, so that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. Chapter 2. Book of Esther, chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus had calmed down, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what was decreed against her. Then the king's servants who served him said, Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king choose officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, so that they may gather together all the beautiful young virgins into Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, unto the hand of Hegi, the king's officer, the keeper of the women. And let their ointments be given to them, and let the young women who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the young woman was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. And so when the king's commandment and his order was heard, and when many young women had been gathered together unto Shushan the palace, into the land of Hegai, Esther was also brought unto the king's house, into the hand of Hegai, the keeper of women. And the young woman pleased him, and she received kindness from him. And he quickly gave her the ointments for herself, with such things as were set aside to her, and 7 young men who were fit to be given her out of the king's house. And he moved her and her maids into the best place in the house of the women. Esther had not revealed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her that she should not show it. And Mordecai walked every day in front of the court of the women's house, in order to know how Esther did and what was to become of her. Now when every maid's turn had come to go into King Ahasuerus, after she had been 12 months, according to the law of the women, for so the days of their anointing were done, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women, then indeed the young woman came to the king. Whatever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women to the king's house. And she went in the evening, and on the next day she returned to the second house of the women, into the hands of Sheasgaz, the king's officer, who kept the concubines. She did not come into the king any more, unless the king delighted in her, and she was called by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, had come to go in unto the king, she asked nothing, but was chosen by Hegai, the king's officer, the keeper of the women. And Esther had favor in the sight of all who looked upon her. And so Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal house in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she received grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so much so that he set the royal crown upon her head, and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, Esther's feast. And he ordered a release for the provinces, and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet revealed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai, as she did when she was brought up with him. And in those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's officers, Bigthan and Teresh, of those who kept the door, were angry and tried to lay a hand on King Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it to Esther the queen. And Esther told the king of it in Mordecai's name. And when the matter was searched into, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Chapter 3. The Book of Esther, chapter 3. After these things King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were in the king's gate bowed and worshipped Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow or worship. Then the king's servants who were in the king's gate said to Mordecai, Why do you transgress the king's commandment? Now when they spoke daily unto him, and when he did not listen to them, they told Haman to see if Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow nor worship him, then Haman was full of wrath. And he scorned to lay hands only on Mordecai, for they had revealed to him the people of Mordecai. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. In the 1st month, that is, the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, the lot, before Haman from day to day and from month to month, to the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar. And Haman said to King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed amongst the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws are different from all people, neither do they keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's gain to allow them to live. If it pleases the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those who have charge of the business, to bring it unto the king's treasuries. And the king took his ring from his hand, and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemies. And the king said to Haman, The silver is given to you, the people also, to do with them as seems good to you. Then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded to the king's lieutenants, and to the governors who were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing of it, and to every people according to their language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by postal riders into all the king's provinces, to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day upon the 13th of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to take what they owned for a prize. The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all the people, so that they should be ready for that day. And the posts went out, being hurried by the king's commandment, and the decree was given to Shushan the palace. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city Shushan was perplexed. Esther chapter 4. When Mordecai understood all that was done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the middle of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. And he even came before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning amongst the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. And so Esther's maids and her officers came and told her. Then the queen was exceedingly grieved, and she sent clothing to clothe Mordecai, and to take away his sackcloth from him. But he did not receive it. Then Esther called for Hatach, one of the king's officers, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. And so Hatach went forth to Mordecai to the street of the city, which was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened to him, and of the sum of money which Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews, in order to destroy them. Also he gave him a copy of the writing of the decree which was given at Shushan, in order to destroy them, to show it to Esther and declare it to her, and to command her that she should go in to the king to make supplication to him, and to seek help for her people. And Hatach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again Esther spoke to Hatach, and gave him commandment to Mordecai, All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that whoever, whether man or woman, shall come to the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his, to put them to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, so that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And then they told Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded them to answer Esther, Do not think within yourself that you shall escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if you are completely silent at this time, then relief and deliverance shall arise to the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house shall be destroyed. And who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to return Mordecai this answer, Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. My maidens and I will also fast in the same way, and so I will go unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. And so Mordecai went his way, and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Chapter 5. We're reading from the Book of Esther, chapter 5. Now on the 3rd day Esther put on her royal clothing, and stood in the inner court of the king's house, across from the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house across from the gate of the house. And when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she received favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And so Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, What do you desire, Queen Esther? And what is your wish? It shall be given to you even to half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, If it seems good unto the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet which I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Cause Haman to hurry, so that he may do as Esther has said. And so the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is your petition, that it shall be granted unto you? And what is your request? It shall be performed even to half of the kingdom. Then Esther answered and said, As to my petition and my request, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition, and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet, which I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. Then Haman went forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he did not stand up nor move for him, he was full of fury against Mordecai. But Haman held himself in, and when he came home he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children, and of all the things in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the princes and the servants of the king. Moreover Haman said, Yes, Esther the queen, let no man but me come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared. And also tomorrow I am invited to her banquet with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then Zeresh his wife and all his friends said to him, Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and tomorrow speak to the king that Mordecai may be hanged on it. Then go in merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Chapter 6. We're reading from the book of Esther, chapter 6. On that night the king could not sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles. And they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers, the keepers of the door, who tried to lay a hand on the king Ahasuerus. And so the king said, What honor and dignity has been done to Mordecai for this? Then the king's servants who served him said, Nothing has been done for him. And the king said, Who is in the court? Now Haman had come into the outer court of the king's house to speak to the king, to hang Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said to him, Behold, Haman stands in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. And so Haman came in, and the king said to him, What shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to honor more than to himself? And Haman answered the king, For the man whom the king delights to honor, let the royal clothing be brought, which the king usually wears, and the horse that the king rides upon, and the royal crown which is set upon his head. And let his clothing and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, so that they may dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and bring him on horseback through the streets of the city, and proclaim before him, This is what shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, Make haste, take the clothing and the horse, as you have said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not fail to do any of all these things that you have spoken. Then Haman took the clothing and the horse, and dressed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, This is what shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning, and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh his wife said to him, If Mordecai is of the seed of the Jews, before whom you have begun to fall, you shall not prevail against him, but shall surely fall before him. And while they were still talking with him, the king's officers came, and they hurried to bring Haman to the banquet, which Esther had prepared. Chapter 7. The Book of Esther, chapter 7. And so the king and Haman came to the banquet of Esther the queen. And the king said again to Esther on the second day of the banquet of wine, What is your petition, Queen Esther, that it may be granted unto you? And what is your request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to perish. But if we had been sold for men slaves and women slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could not make up for the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said to Esther the queen, Who is he, and where is he who dares presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, The man who is our adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to beg for his life from Esther the queen, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman had fallen upon the bed on which Esther was. Then the king said, Will he also force the queen before me in the house? And as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the officers, said before the king, Also look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, stands in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him on it. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was pacified. Esther chapter 8. On that day King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, to Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his ring which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. And Esther spoke yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and begged him with tears to put away the evil of Haman the Agagite, and his plot which he had plotted against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther, and so Esther arose and stood before the king, and said, If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing is right before the king, and if I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to bring back the letters, a sly plan by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see the evil that shall come upon my people? Or how can I endure to see the slaughter of my kindred? Then the king Ahasuerus said to Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and have hanged him upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. And you write for the Jews as it pleases you in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring, no man may turn back. Then the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd of it. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, and to the lieutenants and governors and rulers of the provinces, which are from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing of it, and to every people in their language, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed it with the king's ring. And he sent letters by riders on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries. In them the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to kill, to cause to perish all the power of the people and the province, who desired to attack them, both little ones and women, and to take what they owned for a prize, upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, that is, upon the 13th of the 12th month, which is the month Adar. And the copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was announced to all people, even that the Jews should be ready against that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. And so the post that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hurried and pressed by the king's commandments, and the order was given at Shushan the palace. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal clothing of blue and white, with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city where the king's commandment and his order came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Chapter 9. We're reading from the Book of Esther, chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his order came to be done, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned around so that the Jews had rule over the ones who hated them, the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, in order to lay hand on any who sought their harm. And no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the governors, and the officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became greater and greater. And so the Jews struck all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those who hated them. And in Shushan the palace the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And Parshandatha, and Delphon, and Aspatha, and Poratha, and Adalia, and Aradatha, and Parmashta, and Arasai, and Aradai, and Vayezatha. They killed the 10 sons of Haman, the sons of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the spoil. On that day the number of those who were killed in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. And the king said to Esther the queen, The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition, that it may be granted you? Or what further request do you have? And it shall be done. Then Esther said, If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according to this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded it to be done so. And the order was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews who were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and killed 300 men at Shushan, but they did not lay their hands upon the spoil. But the other Jews who were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together, and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their foes, but they did not lay their hands on the spoil. And on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day of the same, they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were at Shushan gathered together on the 13th of it, and on the 14th of it, and on the 15th of the same they rested and made a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who lived in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and a day of sending portions to one another. And Mordecai wrote these things, and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of Ahasuerus, near and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same yearly, as the days in which the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned into them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, and that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions to one another, and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that is, the lot, to finish them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked plot which he had plotted against the Jews should return upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they call these days Purim, after the name of Pur. Therefore all the words of this letter, and of that which had been concerning this matter, and which had come to them, the Jews ordained, and took upon themselves, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so that it should not fail, that they would keep these days 2 days, according to their writings, and according to their time every year, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from amongst the Jews, nor a memorial of them perish from their seed. Then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim, and he sent the letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the king of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, in order to confirm these days of Purim in their set times, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had ordered them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matter of the fastings and of their cry. And the order of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. Chapter 10. The Book of Esther, chapter 10. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tax upon the land, and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of might, and of the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, with which the king made him great, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next to King Ahasuerus, and great amongst the Jews, and pleasing to the multitude of his brothers, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all of his seed. This concludes the reading of the book of Esther.